Debra Weller is joining us today to talk to us about the impact that her grandfathers had on developing a storyteller. Now, this is a great conversation for all of the grandpas and grandmas out there that want to either release their inner storyteller or learn how to tell some interesting stories that build connection points to the grandchildren. You're going to love this conversation, so stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you again that Grandparents Week is coming up in September. Now, this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for grandparents and even parents to discover interesting topics. Now, Grandparents Week kicks off on Sunday, September 10th and runs the full week through Saturday, September 16th. Some of the topics that will be included in Grandparents Week is artificial intelligence and grandparenting, grandparenting from a distance, first steps for new grandparents, connecting with your teenage grandchildren, resources for raising grandchildren if that happens to be your circumstance, overcoming grandparent alienation, and so much more. Now, Grandparents Week is being provided by Grandparents Academy. You can go to the show notes or my affiliate link, click on those links, and then register for Grandparents Week. There's a free version of this, as well as a more in-depth version of Grandparents Week that you can register and pay for. Now, this is an awesome experience, and I'm so honored to be part of Grandparents Week 2023. So please go today, register for this awesome event. I also want to remind you that I have now uploaded all of the audio episodes of the Cool Grandpa Podcast to YouTube. If you happen to use YouTube to listen to great content, as well as even watch great content, I just wanted to let you know that these episodes are now available on YouTube as well. So you can create your own playlists around topics that you enjoy, as well as being able to easily share the Cool Grandpa Podcast with any of your friends and family who use YouTube as their primary way to access great content. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Debra Weller. Hi, Debra. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to sit down and talk with you this evening.
I am so glad to be here. I'm Debra Weller. I live in St. Augustine, Florida, and I'm so glad that we met through a mutual friend. So it's wonderful to join you tonight.
Yes, this is going to be a treat for us, and it's something that I really enjoy because we're going to talk about storytelling, and you have on here somebody that's an old scoutmaster and cub master, and somebody that even working at summer camps myself, I think we talked about a little bit, that enjoyed telling those stories at campfires and even demonstrating and being an active participant in some of those stories that we had. So this is going to be a real treat for us.
Well, I'm looking forward to sharing some of my information with everyone and just helping everyone to realize story has power in our personal lives, and especially as grandparents with those grandchildren.
Absolutely. And as we get started with this, what I'd love for you to do, and something that I ask a lot of the guests, is if you could take us back to when you found out that you were going to become a grandmother for the first time. I love those stories.
It was about 11 years ago that my son and his wife had returned from a vacation in the Philippines, and they came to our home in California. And they said, "We have some news for you. Ruth is 4 months pregnant." I'm going like, was dancing. They had been married about 4 years at that time. And I was just like, whoa, when? And they said, December, sometime in December. That's what we know right now. We haven't fully been to a doctor yet because we've been in the Philippines. So, of course, they were sending pictures all this time because they live in Scotland. And at that time, I was in California. So the only way I could follow the pregnancy, of course, is through the photos and watching my daughter-in-law grow in her belly and watching my son being concerned. So on New Year's Eve, we got the announcement, and it was 11:58 in Scotland, 5 hours earlier in California. We got the announcement, a text, that Debra Weller had been born. Oh, I couldn't contain myself. First of all, we didn't know how to pronounce his name because it's Gaelic. We had to, could you spell that out phonetically? And of course, it was like, send us pictures. So being a long distance grandparent, we had to wait for those pictures. And my daughter became an aunt also at the same time. So we celebrated New Year's Eve with the birth of this beautiful baby. In February, I was able to go and meet our 6-week-old grandson with my daughter. Took up time from work. We went over to Scotland and just holding that baby for the first time. Oh my gosh. And you know what was really beautiful was seeing my son as a father and his wife as the mother, but seeing him tenderly care for that sweet little baby and change his nappies and cuddle him. Oh, that was like, I never expected that it would come quite naturally in some ways to him. So I held my grandson for the first time and sang him songs. And my husband got to meet him in the summertime when he was almost 6 months old. And he got to meet his grandson for the first time. So even though long distance, we got to do that. Then about 4 years later, our little granddaughter was born. She's getting ready to celebrate her 8th birthday on July 3rd. And we waited 6 weeks to go over and see her. And we got to hold that precious little human as well.
Oh my, that is a great story. And it's so much fun to listen to people's experiences along those lines because they're so different and they're so impactful. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. Now,
I love it because, you know, you have visions. Well, when I'm a grandmother or a grandfather, what will I be, right? What will I do? Well, they live in Scotland, so I haven't been able to be that come on over on Saturday afternoon, Granny, and let's make cookies, or I'm, go do the babysitting and help out here and there. But when I go over there, it's full nonstop being a Grammy and my husband being a grandpa. And we just devote our whole time. We don't go sightseeing or anything. It's totally kid time.
Oh, wow. I bet that's really an awesome experience. And it's interesting, too, because you bring that up with my daughter-in-law. Her grandmother's in Scotland. And so we've had the experience of seeing Grandma come from Scotland for her wedding that we had up in Virginia. And then also with the birth of our grandson and granddaughter, having those trips, like you said, when she comes over, it's family time, it's all of that. And it's like, well, wait a second, we have the Washington Monument, just down the road. It's like, I don't care about that. I want to be with the kids.
Exactly. And I've seen a little bit of Scotland, of course, and on my own. But it's like, no, I came here because I'm kid starved.
I do want to pivot a little bit as we start to get into talking about storytelling and have you briefly talk about your grandfathers and the impact that they had on you as far as storytelling and those memories that you have, because I think that's a great way to introduce the power of storytelling and the power of stories.
If everyone thinks back, who was the storytellers in their family? who were those people, the grandfather, the grandmother, the great auntie, cousins, whoever it was. Well, for me, it came from the paternal part of my family. So my father's father told stories all the time and would make up characters. We called him Pocky. That was his name that he was dubbed with. And he would tell us these amazing stories about his life growing up in New York. And they, of course, were young adults during World War II. And they explained all about the situations with their victory gardens and being captains on their teams for the blackouts and everything. But what I loved was when we were kids in the car, he would tell us about the Joe drivers, and sometimes using some expletives, to which my sweet grandmother would say, now, Father, please do not use that language in front of the children. And she'd tap him on the knee. But we regaled in it and thought it was hysterical, and we would laugh in the back seat. And he was a minister, he was an Episcopal priest. And so he loved our dolls, and we'd bring them in, and he would baptize our baby dolls that we got for Christmas. So those are part of the beautiful memories I have with that one. Now, on my father's side, that was my father's father, excuse me. On my mother's side was my Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Joe loved Westerns. So when we go over there, we'd watch the Westerns with him. And he worked for the Dixie Brewery in New Orleans, where I grew up. Of course, he loved to take us to the brewery and show off his little granddaughters. And he would tell us stories, too. He was a merchant marine, and so he told us about some of his travels as a young man. But we just loved how he would tease us and bring us into these stories that he'd make up in a minute. So my own father then did that with my children, even though he was a long-distance grandfather. We lived in New Jersey and he lived in Florida. But he would tell us these stories about growing up in New York and tell them to his children and talk about the bagel bender. The bagel bender lived under every grate in the city and made bagels with his big black dog. And so when we were living in New Jersey, my 4-year-old niece came to visit. We went into Philadelphia and we were walking on the street, and we walked to a grate. And because she had been storied with this same story, the next generation, she stopped, looked down into the grate and said, do you think the bagel bender's under there with his black dog? So it became kind of family legend. These stories that my father was now passing down to his grandchildren. So yes, we have the power, grandmothers, grandfathers, whoever we are. We can make up legacy stories. We can make up fantasy stories with our grandchildren. We can have them create the stories with us and tell them the family history. Pass that on. That is our job, and to honor the generations of time when they are alive and to get those stories from them so all subsequent generations can have those stories too. So record those stories, write them down. Don't let them be lost in the wind.
Oh, I love that. And that's one of the things that I try to talk with people about and even remind other grandfathers is that we have this connection to, let's say, our parents and our grandparents. Within that, we have about 100 years of family memories. If we think about it, my grandfather was born, I believe, 1919. So from listening to his stories about growing up, that I can turn around now 100 years later and start telling my grandson about, that's 100 years that's inside of me and inside of a lot of people. Not necessarily everybody, but a lot of people have that, where they can pass on that, where, who you are, where you came from, and hopefully with the little ones, it's where are you going?
I love that idea of where you're going, but you're right. We are the conduits of the generations. And we are the conduits of passing on that family history. And we really need to be cognizant of that, because in this very digital age, our children might not be as connected in the past. So I do a lot of family history. And what I do on my family history site, Family Search, I upload pictures, current pictures, and whatever past pictures I have into this system so that in the future, the children can look at these too. And I annotate each photograph. I can also do a voice recording about it. And that is important. I'm using current technology to keep those stories alive in the best way I can. And I made books for each of my grandchildren. It was, you might have seen them in the bookstores, like a grandfather remembers, a grandmother remembers, and it gives you prompts. It's like a journal, so it gives you prompts. So when my babies were born, I immediately started that book. And I wrote about my life, and I put in photographs of people and put the family tree together for them so that they would have this tangible thing rather than something only on a digital resource. They would have this tangible book that they could go through and look at to know, like you said, who are you? Where did you come from? Who are the members of your family?
Yeah, I love that. And I love the idea of still keeping that a very tactile experience. Mm-hmm. There's something I always thought was special about the families that had the family Bible, let's say, that's over 100 and something years old, that had the who originally received it, when those wedding dates were, when those birth dates were, all that family history that was still in that old dusty book.
And those are the treasures that someone has to be the legacy keeper in the family. And as grandparents, we can take that role on. We know our lives are finite. We don't know when our time will be up on this earth. But if we can take the time now to make those legacy books, and there's so many ways that we can make those books without it being a lot of effort. Whereas, my mother gave me a box of photographs. When she died, I had to go through all these photographs. I had to hope there was a date on them, but I had to identify who the people were. That's how I learned about my family history, since so many of our members of the family had passed. But I think we can take that on as a gift that we give to these grandchildren to let them know their heritage and be connected to it.
Oh, sure. And one of the questions that I had was that I think as we get older, we lose that ability to tell stories, or at least it diminishes. I think when we're little kids and we're playing with action figures or dolls or whatever it is, we've got stories in our minds about what's going on and how all this is working. And then I think as we get older, that ability to tell stories sometimes diminishes unless you happen to be a creative writer. But are there things that you found that we can do to start to reconnect with being able to tell a good story and an impactful story?
I'm glad that you brought that up, because yes, we lose that ability sometimes to create that story, the story structure. But you're right, children, it's a natural thing. They're playing all the time, and in their play, they're using dialogue. They're making personification with characters coming alive, They are creating this mystical, magical world. And now adults have translated that into the video games that they're attached to, in a form of storytelling, digital storytelling. But here's what I would recommend, that read those fables and folk tales again and again to your grandchildren. Make recordings of you reading those videos or just audio recordings. Once you start reading those stories again, you will see the patterns of the storytelling. A good story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, and interesting characters and a problem to solve. And when we just keep it simple and look for that in some of the classic stories and the richness of the language that can be in there, I usually recommend to people that they read the story about 5 times, close the book, visualize that story, and just tell what you remember, kind of basic comprehension. Don't worry if you left parts of it out. Just tell what you remember. And if you start practicing that with your grandchildren, you will find that it starts to come to you, that basic story structure. Then when you want to invent a story with the grandkids, you can set that up for them with a basic once upon a time or there was. And when you have some beginning statements, you can get off onto the story path and choose some characters. I know, like for my father, it was the bagel bender, and that was one of the main characters of the many stories he just made up on the spot. For my grandfather, it was the Joe driver, So each of us can have our little kind of shtick, of who these characters are. So the grandkids will say, "Hey, tell us about the dinosaur that was green." And my father, I called him Garbage Man because he would tell me stories. He wasn't a garbage man; he was an accountant, but he would tell me garbage man stories that he would make up on the spot. So that became our little fun thing together. Tell me a story about the garbage man, Dad. And as grandparents, you would love for those children to, well, let's make up a story together. Or, hey, Grandpa, there's a character you always use. Like for me, I have Purple Monster, a puppet. And when I do videos with my grandchildren on FaceTime or, we're on Zoom together, is Purple Monster there? Can he come out to play? So we had this thing going with these characters that they are anticipating. And you, as the grandparent, have that wonderful chance. Now, do your stories have to be perfect? Do they have to be literary? Absolutely not. Hopefully they'll be silly. Whatever your personality is, put it into the story. Add that humor that kids love, and add a little bit of complexity to it, or have just fun, unusual things that happen. One fun thing you might do is Mad Libs. Are you familiar with Mad Libs?
Yes, I loved them as a kid.
Well, I would recommend to grandparents to get some of those ready to go. And if you're a long distance one like me and you're doing FaceTime with your grandchildren, go ahead and buy them the same one, send it to them in the mail, whatever. And then when you're together, you can fill it in because you're adding the verbs, the nouns, it's all parts of speech. And wow, what a great way to teach grammar. So I would recommend Mad Libs as a fun, interactive way to make story.
Oh, that's a great idea. And that also brings up, too, something that we've talked about before, some of these different tools that you've talked about. And you've already brought up puppets, but what are some of those other tools that we could use to help tell the story as well as entertaining the kids?
Right. And, sometimes having those tools it brings forth a story. Same as if you were sitting around a Thanksgiving table and you gave everybody an object. And then you started creating a story as a group called a story round. Everybody has an object in their hand, and one person starts the story, and then the next person has to pick up whatever that person started and add to it based on the object they have in their hand. So I think object storytelling is fun. You can put some objects in a bag or have the kids go on a scavenger hunt around the house and find some objects that they would like to make stories with. It gets to be pretty hilarious because you have to find a connection, let's say, between a wooden egg and a pair of beads. How do we find a connection with those things? It can get quite hilarious. Another good suggestion, bring out those family photos because those are the memory keepers. It jogs a memory. Like when we look at, this is you when you were born. Look at what a little baby you were. Now you're a big grown-up boy. And you can look at this as well as those legacy pictures of ancestors. Where did they come from? Did they come on a boat to America? How did they get there? What country did our ancestors live in Europe? Where did they come from? Getting out maps and talking about it. But I think vacation stories are a lot of fun too. Remembering where you went on a vacation as a kid. I would tell them stories about being 3 kids in the back of a red Rambler, going up a winding, smoky mountain road and having the clouds come right through the car. And we would be on our way to Fontana Dam for our family vacation. And 3 kids in a car, and we were all, poking one another and bugging one another. They like to hear that about what you did when you were a kid with your brothers and sisters. Another fun thing to do, yes, the puppets are wonderful. I make a variety of silly puppets, and you can make them with your grandchildren. Find stories you love and let them make the characters. Just cut them out of paper, put them on a popsicle stick, keep it real simple. Or you can use found objects to make them, and they can use toilet paper rolls and paint little eyeballs on them and add things to them. So tools that we can use are, like I said, the found objects, picture cards. Go through magazines and just cut out pictures of people, places, and things. Put them on index cards. And if you color code them, it helps. People, places, and things. You can make a game. The people, places, and things game. They choose one person, one object, one thing, and the one place. And then we all have to work together to make a story, or each individual makes a story based on those picture cards cut out from magazines. So I think the best part is you can draw pictures about stories. Let's say you're telling the story of the 3 little pigs. Everybody has to draw a picture of what they think the wolf looks like, or what they think the pigs look like, and what their houses look like. And then you can compare those pictures. So those are some ideas that I have right now that would come out. And I think, remember, it should be fun and engaging. And we want to move them away from their screens to having really good quality time with us. If you make it game-like, they will engage. And if you make it silly and fun based on whatever they're involved in, and you can include, you want to include some of their favorite characters from movies, that's fine too. I usually try to move away from that because I want them to use their imaginations and come up with their own characters rather than just relying on a script that an adult has already created on a video screen for them.
Oh, sure. That makes great sense. And I love the people, places, and things game. And because that seems so simple that, like you said, find those images, color code the back of the cards or whatever, and you can do it on index cards.
Absolutely.
Shuffle them around and let the kids pick them out and then work that story out.
Yes. And what does this do for the child and the adult? First of all, it's the connection piece. But we are lighting up different brain centers. When they do video games, they're only getting the back of their head lighting up, according to the PET scans I have seen of this studies. But when we engage them in reading aloud or telling stories, listening to music with them, their whole brain is lighting up. So it's brain-based research of the value of the story. They're also learning vocabulary. They are learning to create and think on their feet. What I have found being a teacher for 30 years, all the kids who were in my storytelling clubs after school, this is what the teachers would tell me. Debra, they are the best writers and the best speakers in the classroom. So we're giving our grandchildren public speaking practice. We're giving them creating stories so that they could write these stories. We're helping them to engage their imagination just for fun, not making it a lesson too. And vocabulary, the communication skills. We're all engaged. We're looking one another in the eye. We're creating something together. So we're learning how to collaborate.
Oh, I love that. And have you found with parents and grandparents, different types of settings lend themselves to different types of stories? And where I'm thinking is sometimes there's the conversations around the kitchen table after dinner, or as I'm going back in my Scoutmaster grandpa, the sitting around the campfire type settings. Have you found some connections with those the impacts with the settings plus the stories?
Right. The settings will sometimes bring it on. Like when you're around the table, let's say Thanksgiving, Christmas holiday, or just having dinner together, the conversations can be, the good news, the bad news of the day. The good news was, the bad news was, or problem solving. Did anybody solve a problem today? Did anybody show kindness? We can talk about empathy and emotions, the character counts kind of conversations of, did you do any good in the world today? Or did you show kindness? So we can also do a check-in to those children and see how they're doing emotionally. And sometimes that has to happen one-on-one. We can have that one-on-one time with that one child when you're, out in the car with them, or you've taken that one child out for a treat or ice cream. And yes, the campfires are a great place, that you might make Boogie Monster stories coming up that all the kids at a certain age love. But I would say that create that space. Don't just always wait and hope that it'll happen. You can become the story grandparent, where they start to know that when my Grammy comes or when I go visit them, there's going to be story time. We're going to have a little rug on the floor. We're going to turn the lights low. Maybe we'll light a candle, or we'll go outside on the porch, or we'll be taking a walk to a special place in the park, and that's our story bench. These are creating traditions with the children so that they come to associate you with storytelling, come to associate you with this wonderful power. It also can help us if we help a child without pointing fingers at them. If you know they're having some difficulties, let's say making friends, or at school, or talking back to family members, or being bothered by siblings, instead of pointing fingers, we can create a story with another character that you walk them through a story, and the character has some qualities or has a problem similar to what the child is facing. These are cautionary tales. Help them then. You bring that story to a little crescendo where the character's having a problem. Somebody's calling them names at school. And then you say, what would you do? How would you solve that problem? How can you help this character be braver or have more courage? And then bring it back to the child and say, did you ever have that kind of problem at school? You can say, when I was a kid, I had that problem. Or my brothers and sisters always teased me, So you can have a sacred time with the child one-on-one too. If you know there's something going on with your child and your grandchild, you can say, do a gentle way of bringing them into a story and helping them to see hope, helping them see there's a way to overcome. It's a hero's journey is what it is. Help them to make that hero's journey so maybe they can get out of the situation they're in a better way and have the courage to see the hope at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, I love that. And especially the idea that I was being drawn to was that idea of the hope of getting through something that's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It may not even be something that they can necessarily overcome or something that they could affect themselves, but it may just be troubles in their life, whatever that is, but it's okay, you can move through this.
You can give them strategies through story by having the character try out the strategies and then asking the child, hey, how did the character get through that? It must have been really hard, don't you think? And have them empathize with the character. And there's folk tales, of course, and fables that show that way. You don't always have to dream this up in your head. You can look for some good stories. There's a lot of social emotional literature out now for children that can help them work through. I know one of them, Sophie's Volcano, where Sophie gets really mad and doesn't know how to control her emotions and wants to explode like a volcano. That's so visual. You could even draw that with the kids, draw those kinds of things out with them. So I think when we can take that role of being that loving conduit to keep the doors open, because sometimes I know when my sister became a teenager, she and my mother had conflicts all the time, but she went to my aunt. And my aunt was able to help her through story, through encouragement, get through her teenage years when mom was kind of going a little crazy having a teenager in the house. And we might be that person for our grandchild. If the family's going through a divorce, you still want to connect with those little ones, or even if they're teenagers, no matter what. If mom or dad are sick, they've lost their jobs, we can be that chance for them to dump their emotions without judging.
Right. And I love that because it really uses that story as that connection point, and you don't even have to bring up necessarily what's going on or ask them directly, because you probably know what's going on, so you can share the story of something that's very similar to what they're experiencing, and that story and everything is pretty safe because it's not them, right? It's
not them.
There's a little distance.
You brought up that it's safe, like letting the puppet tell the story. The folk tales were written, the Grimm's fairy tales, they're pretty grim. They were written as cautionary tales, the Native American stories, African folk tales, Panchatantra tales from India. They were written to teach and help children deal with problems in life. So they have a lot of wisdom. Fables, they always have a moral in them. You can always find one that deals with the situation that the child might be going through. So yes, we have this opportunity to be that safe person for our grandchildren, the person who's welcome or just plain silly, because that's what they love too, right? Make things light for them when they're going through a hard time, but not discount what they're going through.
Oh, sure. Well, and you have to have that balance, right? Otherwise, if it's grandpa is always telling these downer stories, like they're definitely going to want to jump into a screen and not deal with that.
Yeah. That's why we have to be lighthearted. Knowing our grandchildren really well and loving them is the one thing. Knowing what makes them excited, knowing what is fun to them, and trying out some material on them that, they might be, whoa. And, a dinosaur can become a great kind of character. And we know they all love that at a certain point. There can be with the little girls, I don't want to just speak, saying little girls only, princesses, solving problems. The wonderful book by Robert Munch is The Paper Bag Princess, sorry. And she is a princess who decides after her castle is burned down by a dragon, she befriends the dragon. And then the prince comes to save her. And she says, you are not worthy of me, because you put me down for my hair being singed. I am not going to marry you. So it showed some power for the princess in the story. And Robert Munch has absolutely hysterical stories. He is a Canadian writer, and they're very real about real family situations. So I think spend some time in the library reading some of the beautiful literature for the kids and finding some favorite authors that you think you could model some stories
Oh, sure. In like we were talking about our own pasts and our own, even the movies that I remember, right? That haven't been out. There's no way my grandkids have seen them. But those are stories there that I could change some things around as appropriate and just have some fun with it as an easy way to get into storytelling.
That is so awesome that you brought that idea of a movie, because we started as young kids and, I remember going to the movies. It was such a cool thing. And remembering some of those stories or cartoons. Think of the cartoons you watch. Could you not have Foghorn Leghorn, or we have the perennial Roadrunner situation, Bugs Bunny, Pepe Le Pew, all these characters that we can reinvent and just give a new character, but keep the storyline. It's already there for you. You don't have to make it up.
Right. I love it. From your experience, is there, I guess this is going to put us on the spot, but any differences that you've come across between the impacts that the grandfathers can have with their storytelling and grandmothers have with their storytelling?
Each person is a little different in their delivery. My grandmother would tell me stories being on a farm. And then my grandfather was, a little more about the moment, whatever he could do to get a rise out of us, or my father, whatever he could do to sometimes terrorize us with stories of these monsters coming out at night. So I think some grandfathers have a very gentle spirit about them. Maybe they're telling stories, they're out fishing with their kid and they're telling fish stories and just remembering things, about their growing up, maybe farm, city, hardships that they faced being a different generation. I think we have the power to tell them those stories. So grandfathers bring their own spirit to the story. And grandmothers have another whole way of doing it, and each can be just as raucous as the other one, right? But knowing your style of what makes you laugh and what you want to pass on to that child, inventing characters together, remembering your past, your growing up, they will love it. And even though those teenagers sometimes will roll their eyes, geez, tell me another story. It's not that way at all. They really love it underneath. They're just, going through their teenage stuff that they do. But I think bring your own style into it. Don't try to be someone else. Whatever grandfather or grandmother you are, you bring it. You've had experience, camping. Those stories have got to be great. Some grandparents or grandfathers might be hunters. Some might have worked on shipyards, done manual labor, just the struggles that they might have had growing up, being a different generation, a different time, not having all the technology that we have now. Some of our grandfathers fought wars for us and have injuries. And I think it's really important when those grandfathers are open to telling those stories of the war. And sometimes that's very sacred and they don't want to talk about it. But we do need to pass on those stories that were hard, as well as the stories that taught them lessons. Our granddaughters and our grandsons need to hear from both Grandma and Grandpa's point of views. But sometimes it can happen that they might not always hear it from Grandpa. Grandma might take over a little bit. I have to watch myself. Sometimes I just take over and I don't give my husband enough time to just be himself with the kids. So I need to walk out of the room sometimes, go out for a while and just let him have time with them, because otherwise I'll probably be some other grandmother, and denying him that right to have that interaction with them.
That's great advice, and I love that insight. Debra, is there anything about storytelling that I haven't asked you or that you would love to bring up?
Well, I just think if you go online, you can find tutorials about storytelling. I have some on my YouTube channel, Debra Weller Storyteller. And I have tutorials about storytelling, story games. I have family games on there. But I think what you can do is there are books available on how to tell stories. You can get them in the $3.98 section of the library and go online and you'll say, I need a book on how to tell stories, and something will pop up for sure. I think what you just want to realize is don't put the pressure on yourself. Just let it come in a natural, fun way. Don't try to be a polished performing. I've been performing as a professional storyteller for 43 years, but I started out just telling stories as a kid and listening to stories. So we don't have to be professional storytellers. Also find out if there's storytelling groups in your community that you can go and listen to with your grandchildren, storytelling festivals that might be nearby. Online, there's a lot. WorldStorytellingCafe.com has international storytellers performing on that and children performing too. WorldStorytellingCafe.com. And you can engage on these virtual sites and listen to stories together. Another fun one, I do storytelling for Magic Polygon app. And this is a wonderful app that you could share with your grandchildren. It does have a yearly fee of $60 for the app. And you get to make stories together. It's an animation, simple animation, classic stories. You can go on there and you can record your voice telling stories. You can actually arrange for like a Zoom call and the kids can help you make that story together.
Oh, that is wonderful.
Yes. And then there's Memory, KPR, capital KPR, which is a wonderful site for uploading photographs, but you can do audio recordings on it. And your family can be invited to share and they can add to the recording. So if you went on, let's say, a camping activity with them, they can all go back into that same picture and add their own version of the story.
Oh, awesome.
Memory KPR. And that's another app that is available. And they have a free part of that you can record that on there.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Well, and folks, I'll be sure to put links to everything that we were talking about into the show notes. So if you're out driving around or out walking, whatever it is, you can go to the show notes on the website and be able to find links to these different resources. So, Debra, how could people get more in contact with you, follow you? I know you've already mentioned the YouTube channel, but is there any other ways that you'd like people to connect?
Oh, I am on Facebook, Debra Weller. You can find me on Facebook. So I'm there and I frequently post little stories and I sometimes do live storytelling on that site at Deb Storyteller on Instagram. But I'll let you in on a secret. I perform as Mrs. Sunshine Santa Claus. And you can find that on Instagram at Mrs. Sunshine Santa Claus, where I tell myths and legends of the North Pole.
Well, I sure do appreciate you taking time out of your evening to sit down and talk with us about storytelling, the importance of storytelling, and how we can start to exercise that muscle if we've let it atrophy a little bit. So please, from the bottom of my heart, know I really appreciate you being on here.
Well, Greg, I'm so pleased that we were able to be connected. The power of social media can be awesome. And Carrie connected us so that we could have this extra experience together. So to all of your listeners, I just want to let you know, a story. You need to take some home and bring some back to me. Let the wonder of storytelling pervade your life.
Oh, well, thank you. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
I really appreciated Debra taking time out of her day to sit down and share her experiences with her cool grandfathers. I really enjoyed learning more about Poppy and Grandpa Joe. I especially liked the idea that, learning about the bagel bender and how that story impacted multiple generations. That was a fun and fascinating conversation. The other thing I really appreciated Debra doing is sitting down and talking to us about the many different ways that we can use stories to engage our grandchildren, both the very young grandchildren as well as the older grandchildren. It is an awesome idea, I think, to be able to use those fun books, those ad-lib books that I grew up with in elementary school and middle school and just having a blast. I love the idea that grandparents and grandkids could use that fun tool to be able to build up connections. If you want to learn more about Debra, I've got links to everything that we talked about into the show notes. So be sure to check those out. And I'm excited to let you know that I'm going to have Debra back on to talk to us about stories involving the end of the year. Typically, communities would gather around campfires and big dining halls and all sorts of different places to entertain each other through the use of stories. So I'm excited to have her back on shortly to talk to us about how to build up these traditions of these fall and end of year stories with our grandchildren and our families. So stay tuned for those. And thank you again for listening to the Cool Grandpa podcast. And until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.